Hi, and welcome back to another episode of So What Does That Mean? This week's episode is the real cost of subdivisions, what developers often underestimate. This is a huge episode, and as such, we've broken it into two. So enjoy, and we'll see you for the second half next week.
Let's start today's episode with a question we hear quite often. How much does it actually cost to subdivide a property? Because when people first start looking at subdivision projects, the answers they often hear can vary quite a lot. Some people might say $50,000, others might say hundreds of thousands of dollars. And occasionally, people assume it's mainly just surveying and paperwork. But in reality, the true cost of subdivisions can be significantly higher than many people expect.
And that's something we see quite often when developers are evaluating subdivision opportunities. From the surface, the site might look relatively straightforward. The land might be flat, there might already be houses nearby, and it might appear that services are already available. But once the detailed engineering and infrastructure requirements are assessed, the costs can sometimes be quite different from the initial assumptions.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Because subdivision projects are often much more than simply drawing new lot boundaries. They involve infrastructure, services, drainage, and sometimes significant civil construction works.
In today's episode, we're going to break down what actually contributes to subdivision costs. We'll talk about some of the most common expenses developers encounter, and we'll also share a few real-world examples where subdivision feasibility changed significantly once the engineering requirements were properly understood. And before we get too far into today's discussions, this episode is sponsored by JC Engineers. JC Engineers provides development feasibility and due diligence reviews for developers, investors, and property owners who are considering subdivision or development opportunities.
One of the key things about that process is that it looks at both planning constraints and engineering constraints together, because planning rules might tell you what subdivision layout is possible, but engineering analysis often determines what it will actually cost to develop that subdivision.
And bringing those perspectives together can give developers a clearer understanding of feasibility before committing to a property purchase.
Actually, Joe, this might be a good moment to dive into some of the real numbers around subdivision costs. When people first start researching subdivisions, they often hear a wild range of estimates, from as low as $50,000 to over hundreds of thousands. But the truth is, once you factor in all your infrastructure, approvals, and site-specific work, the reality is usually much higher. Let's break it down with some updated figures for 2026 and practical tips to help listeners wrap their heads around.
Wow, that sounds way higher than I expected. As someone new to this, what exactly makes the costs vary so much? And can you give me a bit of a ballpark for a simple two-lot subdivision here in Southeast Queensland?
Location, site conditions like slope or soil type, the number of lots, and infrastructure upgrades are massive drivers. For a straightforward two-lot subdivision in Southeast Queensland in 2026, you're looking at $141,000 to $393,000, accounting for recent inflation and the 3.4% indexation of fees. That's up from $137,000 to $380,000 last year. So yes, costs are climbing due to rising construction materials, labour, and regulatory changes.
Well, that's a pretty big jump. What about if the site is in a growth area like, say, the Sunshine Coast or Moreton Bay? Would that make it cheaper or more expensive?
It often scales up in established infill areas due to utility ties, but in greenfield growth corridors, per lot costs can average $41,000 to $44,000 for basic setups. Now, shifting to bigger markets like Greater Sydney, for example, a simple two-lot subdivision typically ranges from $41,000 to about $103,000. But in premium suburbs with added infrastructure, it can hit $206,000 or more. Council contributions in high-density spots like Sydney's North Shore at about $21,000 per lot just for the fees.
Really? So Sydney sounds pricey. How does Greater Melbourne compare? Is it more affordable there?
Yeah, often a bit lower for basics, around $31,000 to $52,000 for a two-lot setup. But it jumps quickly once civil works and utilities enter the picture. Electricity pit and pipe infrastructure runs $8,500 to $15,500 depending on connection complexity. NBN conduit is around $620 per lot, and sewer or stormwater extensions can add another $15,000 to $40,000 or more, depending on proximity and the depth of work. Victorian subdivision certification fees sit around about $1,500 per 100 lots, with a modest increase expected in 2026. It's also worth factoring in Victoria's Res Code and any applicable neighbourhood character overlay or development contributions plan, which can add compliance layers that affect both design and cost, particularly in established suburban areas. These are benchmarks, not fixed figures. Site conditions, council jurisdiction, and market timing all influence the final number. So get site-specific quotes from a civil engineer and licensed surveyor before committing to any numbers.
Okay, that makes sense. Can you walk me through a detailed cost breakdown? I think listeners like me would underestimate the parts involved.
Absolutely. People often do. Let's start with pre-approval costs, because these are expenses you're committing to before a single bit of turf is turned, and they add up faster than most people expect. Surveying for boundaries typically runs at around $5,500 to $6,500, depending on the size and the complexity of the site. This establishes the legal boundaries and ground conditions that underpin everything else in your application. So it's not a step that you can skip or cut corners on. Council application fees vary depending on how your proposal is assessed. A code accessible to two-lot subdivision on the Gold Coast sits around $2,000, but if your project triggers impact assessment due to overlays, non-compliant setbacks, or other site-specific issues, that climbs to around about $2,500 to $3,000 or more. It's worth checking with your local council early, as fees differ across Queensland. Town planning fees are where costs can vary most significantly, anywhere from $10,500 to $30,000 to $35,000, depending on the complexity of the zoning, whether any overlay assessments are required, and how much back and forth with council is anticipated. A straightforward infill lot in a residential zone will sit at the lower end, while anything requiring a material change of use, a preliminary approval, or a response to information requests from council can push toward the upper range. These are benchmarks, not fixed figures, and obviously site conditions, council jurisdictions, and the experience level of the professionals that you're engaging will all influence the final number. So getting indicative quotes from a registered surveyor and town planner early is essential.
Engineering and civil works sound major. What's that entail, and roughly how much are we looking at?
Yeah, civil works are where subdivision budgets most often blow out, regularly representing 40 to 50% of the total project costs, sometimes more on challenging sites. Stormwater is frequently the biggest single line item. Extending piping down the street to connect to existing network runs, $85,000 to $210,000, depending on pipe diameter, depth, size, with councils increasingly requiring on-site detention systems to top that off. Sewer extensions follow similar logics, $50,000 to $55,000 to $155,000, depending on the proximity and the depth, with deep connections requiring shoring sitting firmly at the upper end. Electrical infrastructure can catch people off guard. Standard connections are manageable, but a new transformer or network upgrade can push costs up to $110,000 or well beyond, depending on what your local distributor determines is required. Water connections and roadworks add another $30,000 to $150,000, depending on whether you're dealing with a simple grading, full road construction, or retaining walls. If your site isn't flat or has poor soil, budget $5,500 to $20,000 for geotechnical reports up front. They're not optional. Everything else gets priced from them, and skipping them early almost always costs more later.
Wow. Are there any hidden costs people forget about?
There are several other costs that catch people off guard that they're not budgeting for from the start. Legal fees for title creation and registration typically runs about $1,500 to $5,500, depending on the number of lots and the complexity of any easements or covenants being created. If you're selling lots rather than retaining them, stamp duty on the transferred titles is an additional consideration that varies by state and sale price. Holding costs are easy to underestimate. Loan interest, council rates, insurance across a typical subdivision timeline of 6 to 18 months can quietly add tens of thousands to your total outlay, particularly in a high interest rate environment. Demolition, if there's an existing structure on the site that needs to be removed, that can add another 10,000 to 30,000 depending on the size, materials, and whether asbestos removal is involved. When you're totaling everything up, pre-approval, civil works, professional fees, utilities, and holding costs, average all-in costs in Southeast Queensland are tracking around about 170,000 per lot. And that figure continues to rise with the construction inflation and increasing council requirements. But as a general rule, budget, around about 20 to 30% contingency on top of your known costs, contaminated soil, unexpected biodiversity offsets, or council information requests mid-assessment are the kinds of surprises that don't announce themselves until you're already committed. And having that buffer is often what separates a viable project from a costly one.
Okay, that sounds pretty smart. Now, shifting to practical stuff, how do I even start without losing money? Like, what's a feasibility assessment?
Step one is always zoning. You need to confirm that your property is zoned for a residential subdivision. Not all residential coded land automatically permits subdivision. The specific zone category determines what's possible and under what conditions. In Queensland, this sits within local government's planning scheme. In New South Wales, it's governed by the local environmental plan. And in Victoria, it's the planning scheme zone administered by council. Minimum lot size is the next critical check. A common threshold in suburban areas, 600 square metres per new lot, but this varies by council and by zone. Some inner ring councils permit smaller lots under medium density provisions, while others impose larger minimums in character or low density zones. Beyond raw lot size, you also need to confirm there's sufficient street frontage and room for a compliant driveway to each new lot, as access requirements can quietly rule out sites that otherwise look viable on paper. Once zoning is confirmed, pull up the overlay maps. Council planning portals and state-level tools like Flood Check in Queensland, the New South Wales Planning Portal, or VicPlan, allow you to identify overlays that could materially affect your property. Flood overlays, bushfire management overlays, biodiversity or vegetation protection overlays, and heritage overlays can all either restrict what's permissible, trigger additional referable agencies, or add significant compliance costs to your design. Identifying these before you proceed, ideally before you've exchanged contract, is one of the most important due diligence steps you can take.
So does flat land matter? And who do I need on my team?
From a site's perspective, flat or gently sloping land is ideal. It keeps civil costs predictable and manageable. As gradient increases, so does the complexity of retaining walls, drainage, design, and earthworks. And costs can escalate quickly on anything beyond a gentle fall. Getting the right team in place early makes a significant difference to both your timeline and your budget. A town planner should be your first call. They'll assess zones, overlay, and likely approval pathways before you're committed to deeply. A registered surveyor handles boundary identification, survey, and ultimately the plan of subdivision that gets lodged with council and the titles office. A civil engineer designs and oversees the infrastructure works, drainage, sewer, roads, and earthworks. And their input is essential before any civil quotes can be meaningfully compared.
Can you break down the process timeline? How long from start to finish do you think?
Understanding the approval pathway in your state is the first step to building a realistic timeframe. In New South Wales, you can purchase a DA through council or, where eligible, a CDC through a private certifier. But the CDC route can be significantly faster for straightforward subdivisions that meet all code requirements. In Queensland, the equivalent distinction is being code accessible and impact accessible developments under the relevant planning scheme. In Victoria, a planning permit application is lodged with council, and for straightforward two-lot subdivisions in established residential zones, timeframes are generally more predictable. In total, budget around 6 to 18 months from lodgement to titles, and assume the upper end until your specific council and site give you the reason to expect otherwise. Neighbour objections, third-party appeals, or council resourcing issues can push timelines out considerably and add legal costs that you hadn't planned for.
So tell me, what are some common pitfalls? I've heard some horror stories.
The most expensive mistake by far is underestimating infrastructure. A site that looks straightforward on paper can unravel quickly once you discover the nearest sewer connection is 2 or 3 blocks away, or that stormwater detention requirements add a significant civil works component you hadn't priced. These aren't edge cases. They're among the most common reasons subdivision budgets double. Get a civil engineer to assess connection distances and council requirements before you're committed. Market timing and location matter just as much as the numbers on your feasibility. Subdividing in a corridor where demand is strong and medians are sitting around $500,000, as seen across much of southeast Queensland, gives you far more margin for the unexpected than subdividing in a flat or declining market where end values are harder to predict.
So with all that in mind, what are the most practical ways to keep subdivision costs under control, and where should you never try to save money?
Where possible, look for ways to reuse existing utility connections rather than extending new ones. A site that already has services stubbed to the boundary, or where existing infrastructure can be shared or upgraded rather than duplicated, can save tens of thousands in civil costs alone. Hey everyone, so this is where we're going to cut the episode into 2. This will end the first part of the real costs of subdivisions, what developers often underestimate. Don't forget to tune in next week for the second part. And don't forget to follow us on all the socials and subscribe to us on YouTube. See ya.